My name's Alopi Latukefu. I'm the director for the Edmund Rice Centre. It's wonderful to have so many here tonight for what will be an amazing presentation and discussion with Dr. Wes Morgan. But it's also a celebration tonight for our fellows who we have from Kiribati, Tuvalu, who just presented their credentials and their names to all of us tonight. Can I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on tonight? The Gadigal and Wangal people of the Eora and Darug nations. This land was never ceded. And we acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging. As I said, my name is Alopi Latukefu. I'm the director for the Edmund Rice Centre. I'm also IT support for tonight. So I'm going to be heading back and letting all the people in who are in the waiting room on Zoom. But without further ado, can I throw to my two main people tonight, Corinne Fagure and Dr. Wes Morgan.
And for those who haven't met me, my name is Corinne, and I am the Senior Manager of Social Justice Advocacy and Research at the Edmund Rice Centre. But this is a relatively new position for me because for the last 6 years, I succeeded Jill in the position of coordinator of the Pacific Calling Partnership. So really, I've been sort of working quite closely with Pacific climate advocacy for the last 6 years. And it's really changed me as a person, I have to say. But tonight, I'd like to welcome our guest, Dr. Wes Morgan. We're very delighted to have you at what is a critical time for Australia and the Pacific. The COP31 bid, which is the bid that Australia is making to host the 31st United Nations Conference of the Parties in Australia, jointly with the Pacific. That bid will be announced, we expect, towards the end of November. Of course, the history of Pacific climate advocacy and how the Pacific has conducted itself and its diplomacy and leadership with regard to climate action is really important at this point in time. And it's important for Australians to know more about it, because when it comes to climate action and climate justice, the Pacific has led the world for a very long time and done it in a way that is very specific to the region and to the Pacific ways of doing business. So that's what we'll be exploring tonight. And I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Wes. So Wes, before we launch into a detailed history of Pacific climate advocacy, can you briefly tell us how this research came about and who was involved?
Yeah, okay. So I lived and worked in the Pacific Islands for 12 years. I moved to Fiji, fell in love with it, fell in love with living and working with Pacific Islanders. I was working at the Pacific Network on Globalization, or PANG, and we were working on trade policy. And then I did a doctorate where I was considering the role that Pacific Island countries have played in global trade negotiations. And that led me, I went to Geneva, I went to the World Trade Organization in Geneva. And what I saw was, you know, there's this narrative that Pacific Island countries are small or vulnerable and in Australia's backyard. But what I learned through doing this research was that Pacific Island countries have an independent identity and place in the world, and were able to really shape global discussions, and including on trade. And when I finished my doctorate, I thought, actually, trade policy is really boring. And I didn't really want to talk about trade anymore. But I had learned a lot about how Pacific Island countries are able, you know, that they don't have much treasure, they don't have many guns, but Pacific Island countries were able to work together as a block of countries and be really influential in global politics on really important issues. So I had learned about it through trade, but I also then came to learn that as Pacific Island countries have really shaped global discussions on the management of the world's oceans, on decolonization, which is unfinished business, on the nuclear issues, and then on climate. So I was very keen to understand the role that Pacific Island countries play in global climate negotiations. And I was lucky enough to team up with Dr. George Carter, who's at ANU. He's Samoan descent. And Flori Manoa, who's at the University of the South Pacific. And George did his doctorate on Pacific Island countries in global climate negotiations. And Flori did her master's on Pacific Island countries in New York at the United Nations. So how Pacific Island countries organize at the Pacific Small Island Developing States in New York. And so it was kind of my research, George's research, Flori's research meant that, and we did things like we went to COPs. Like George goes to all the COPs. Where in the world is George Carter right now? He's always traveling. And Flori went to New York, and the three of us drew on that to draft a history of the role that Pacific Island countries have played in the global climate discussion. And we've written that up as an accessible journal article and as a chapter in a book. And, I think that's why I'm here today, to be able to share some of what we learned together.
Beautiful. And quick plug, this is a great book. If you haven't read it and you're interested in the relationship between Australia and the Pacific when it comes to climate, I really, really recommend it. So it's a great book. Where and how did Pacific nations first get involved in international climate diplomacy?
So, an international consensus, scientific consensus around climate change really emerged in the mid-1980s. That, it had been around for a while before then, but it was in the mid-1980s that you had a series of international conferences that brought the science to the attention of policymakers. And it was no different in Pacific Island countries, where Pacific governments started to think and want to know, what does this mean for us? So there was regional studies conducted by the South Pacific Regional Environment Program, SPREP, with support from the United Nations in 1988, 1989. And very quickly, these studies revealed that particularly for countries like Tuvalu, countries like Kiribati, that sea level rise poses a particular problem, right? Because for atoll nations that rise a matter of meters above the sea, it's a problem even before sea level rise begins to have coastal inundation. It affects, as we've heard already, it affects your drinking water. It becomes more salty. And so very early, the Pacific realized this is an existential threat. This is a threat to our existence as nations and as people. And Pacific leaders responded very quickly. I'm talking 1989, 1990, Pacific countries issued collective statements calling for a global treaty to reduce industrial greenhouse gas emissions, a legally binding global treaty, really early. This was what the Pacific wanted. And not only Pacific countries, so Pacific Island countries in 1989 met with counterparts from the Caribbean and from the Indian Ocean in the Maldives. And it was an important conference. There was a little bit, but then that led to the establishment of the Alliance of Small Island States, because island nations around the world realized that climate change and sea level rise poses a threat to their existence. So pretty early on, they formed a diplomatic bloc. And, at the United Nations, all independent nations have a vote in multilateral diplomacy. So by the time you bring together all the small island states, you have a pretty significant bloc at the UN. And so very early on, we had this coalition emerge. Tuvalu, the Tuvalu Prime Minister at the time, I won't pronounce his name correctly, but Painu was his last name. Painu was a global figurehead at this time. So, you know, the first international conferences on what to do about the climate problem, he was there telling leaders like Margaret Thatcher from the UK, you know, what we need is a global treaty that will see a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Tuvalu is still leading the discussion today, but Tuvalu really and the Pacific, working with this alliance of small island states, got the ball rolling.
And this idea of a coalition, this development of a coalition with other small islands and other countries is a technique that is repeatedly used over the next decades. I know in 1992, the UNFCCC convention was agreed to and developed. What role did Pacific nations play in that process?
Yeah, so, you know, at that time, you know, the world had already, in the 80s, we'd had the ozone and the world had responded pretty quickly to ban CFCs and the like and to deal with the hole in the ozone. And there was hope that the world would be able to deal pretty quickly with climate change. We've since learned that that's not the case, but they did negotiate this United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which, you know, the short version is that they agreed to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference in the Earth's climate system. Unfortunately, we haven't met that goal. But, you know, countries like Vanuatu at that time were calling for polluters to be held responsible for damage that they cause and to provide compensation to countries for the loss and damage. You know, people in Tuvalu and in Vanuatu, they're not the ones causing climate change. You know, it's wealthy nations like Australia and industrialized countries that are causing climate change. So at that time, I mean, this is because now, many years later, 30 years later, we have a loss and damage fund that they're talking about establishing. But Vanuatu got that ball rolling in 1991 with the Vanuatu ambassador to the United Nations at the time. So the UNFCCC, it doesn't actually require countries to cut emissions. It's a framework convention for continuing collaboration amongst countries. So the Pacific didn't get everything that they wanted, but they did get some special seats allocated in the UNFCCC bureaucracy for small island states. So very early on, there was this acknowledgement globally that small island states have a unique position in the global discussion about climate change because they're uniquely impacted.
And then we have in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol.
Yeah, and so almost immediately the Pacific said, okay, we've got this convention. Now we need that treaty we've been talking about, a global treaty to cut emissions. And the first draft of what later became the Kyoto Protocol was put on the table as an AOSIS protocol, an Alliance of Small Island States protocol. And Nauru put it on the table. Ambassador Marlene Moses from Nauru has been in there forever, but she proposed, so it came from the Pacific, the idea of a binding treaty for industrialized countries to cut emissions. And it was at this time, unfortunately, that Australia went a different way. So Australia, around the mid-90s, assessed its interests as being really connected with Australia's fossil fuel exports and Australia's coal and gas exports. And Australia couldn't go with the Pacific in support of this proposal, the AOSIS protocol. So actually at that year's Pacific Islands Forum, John Howard, he had a hell of a time in 1997. And they had a leaders retreat, which they do every year at the annual Pacific Islands Forum leaders meeting. And, you know, they had a big fight. And, you know, this has happened a few times since then. But at key moments, the Pacific has been really leading the proposals for ambitious action at the global level. And unfortunately, Australia hasn't been able to go with them. So in the lead up to Kyoto, we saw similar in the lead up to Copenhagen. So in 2009, there was a proposal for because Kyoto, the US never signed up, Australia didn't sign up. It only ever covered the emissions of a relatively small group of countries. So we were always going to need another global agreement to tackle climate change. And there was high hopes that would happen in 2009 in Copenhagen. And the Pacific commissioned scientific research as to what was needed. And there was, really built this consensus around 1.5 degrees in 2009. So there's a cry in the Pacific of 1.5 to stay alive. This idea that we need to hold global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees for countries like Kiribati, countries like Tuvalu, to have an ongoing future.
And that's an idea that comes from the Pacific, that goal.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and particularly around that time, around 2008 and in the lead up to 2009, there was this idea that a new global agreement should aim to limit the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. And Copenhagen failed because the global climate talks really often come down to a fight between rich nations and poorer nations. And rich nations are responsible for climate change, having been the biggest emitters for the longest time, and have responsibilities as wealthy nations to help developing countries deal with climate impacts, but also to new technologies to implement their own clean energy transitions. But what it meant, it was really hard to get a global agreement. And in Copenhagen, the short version is China and the United States, respectively developing and developed countries, could not arrive at an agreement. So people might remember Obama showed up and everything kind of went to pot. But the point of that is that the Pacific then helped to revive the global climate talks. So after Copenhagen, the short version is we ended up with the Paris Agreement in 2015. But to get from the shambles of Copenhagen to a new global agreement in 2015, that took real leadership from the Pacific. Pacific Island countries have at various times played, as I've already mentioned, Vanuatu and Tuvalu. And so RMI, the Marshall Islands, played a really important role, as did Tuvalu and Kiribati, but particularly Tony de Brum, because what he did and the team around him was they stitched together a coalition of countries that were prepared to work towards a global agreement and find some common ground, but ambitious common ground. You can't just agree on nothing. And they met in the sidelines of the UN General Assembly discussions in New York, and they had all their discussions in person, wrote things down, pen and pencil, because they were worried about other countries monitoring their emails and whatnot. So really early on, and it was a group of developing countries and some wealthy nations, and there was like 5 of them, then 10 of them. And then at a certain point, when they had realized, the core of what they thought should be in what later became the Paris Agreement, they then invited other countries to join. So in Paris in 2015, what became known as the High Ambition Coalition emerged with Tony de Brum from the Marshall Islands as the leader of the High Ambition Coalition. And they invited the Alliance of Small Island States, African countries, and it quite quickly swelled in numbers to over 100 countries in the first week of negotiations in Paris. And if it wasn't for that innovative leadership and from de Brum, we might not have the Paris Agreement. We might not have the global agreement that we do have for tackling climate change. So in Paris, in the final plenary, after the intense global expectations, Copenhagen's failed. All the world's diplomats are there, nearly 200 of them. And there's the main plenary discussions as, you know, the French are holding the presidency and they're going to hit the gavel. And Tony de Brum, he's walking down and he has at his side, he has the US lead climate negotiator, the European lead climate negotiator is not far away. And he has on his lapel, on his jacket, he has a woven pandanus leaf. And it was woven by some of the women in the Marshall Islands delegation. And if you were in the negotiations and you were wearing one of these, it meant that you were a member of the High Ambition Coalition. And it was how in these, you know, really quite dry diplomatic spaces, people knew, and it was how they built the momentum needed to get an agreement over the line, finally. And they did. And the Paris Agreement has been profoundly important. So that was 2015. We're less than a decade away. You know, since then, the world has, the Paris Agreement, they didn't get 1.5 degrees. They got a compromise language that the world will agree to limit warming to well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So they got this slightly fudged language, but we do have now a global consensus that we're going to try and limit warming to well below 2 degrees. And the science tells us that to achieve that, we need to achieve net zero global emissions by the middle of this century. So, you know, it sounds like, okay, 1.5 degrees, like that's a small number, but it's actually a radical reorganizing of the whole global economy that is required, you know, how we power ourselves, how we get around. But the Paris Agreement builds in a mechanism to get there. And the Pacific and de Brum played a key role getting this mechanism, which is every 5 years, countries have to set a new national target to cut emissions. And they couldn't get a binding agreement that all countries will cut emissions by X amount. You bring your own target. So Australia will set its own target. China will set their own target. But you have to bring a new one every 5 years, and it has to be stronger than the last one. And so in that way, we have this organised transition that is happening now globally towards net zero. And we can thank the leadership of the Pacific for their role in getting us the Paris Agreement.
Paris was a great moment of hope, and I'm not going to negate that it is an important agreement. Yet we haven't made the progress since Paris that we were hoping for in terms of greenhouse gas emissions or climate finance for that matter. So in recent years, we see the Pacific resort to a growing number of tactics in this space outside of the COP framework, the UN COP framework. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of these tactics?
Yeah, so to be sure, the Pacific's always been really innovative. So there's been this global leadership in the UN Conference of Parties, the official climate talks, but the Pacific's also tried to do other things. So they tried to get the UN Security Council to talk and think about climate change. The Pacific successfully sponsored the first UN General Assembly resolution on climate change and security in 2009. The Pacific still leads a Friends of Climate and Security country grouping at the UN Security Council now. And, you know, 15, 20 years ago, the Pacific was fairly isolated, but now all the major powers are thinking about climate change as a security issue in the same way that the Pacific was. So again, they've been global leaders. But yes, the UN climate talks, they only deliver incremental change. And what we need is much faster change. You know, we need to be cutting emissions. We need to be trying to cut emissions in half this decade, which needs radical commitment from governments. And so the Pacific's been pursuing a range of innovations like, just to take one example at the moment, there is a few. So I could rattle off a list, right? But the Pacific is calling for, well, has led a diplomatic campaign for the International Court of Justice to issue an advisory opinion on state obligations with regards to climate change and human rights. And the Pacific won that campaign in the sense that they had a resolution passed at the UN and have directed the International Court of Justice to issue that advisory opinion. and it's still coming, but it will clarify the obligations that governments have to cut emissions and to take action on climate change in order to protect human rights. Another one that's really exciting is the Pacific is currently leading a global campaign for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. And, it draws on language from the nuclear non-proliferation campaigns of the past, but it's really a campaign that seeks to say, look, this product is causing damage, destruction, harm. It is a threat to our existence as nations, and we need to work out ways to manage the phase out of the production of coal, oil and gas as fast as possible. And 11 Pacific Island countries are currently members, support the idea of a fossil fuel treaty, a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. So that's very exciting. They've pressed for an understanding of the region as a fossil fuel-free Pacific. So at the leaders' meeting last year, Pacific leaders agreed that they said that they aspire to a fossil fuel-free Pacific. And that was kind of challenging for Albanese in some ways, because he went, and there was some history repeats, because last year the meeting was in Aitutaki in the Cook Islands. It's an atoll island in the Cook Islands, which was where the Pacific had a big fight with John Howard in 1997 in the lead up to the Kyoto Protocol. But the challenge for Australia is we're the world's second largest fossil fuel exporter, after Russia. We're a major producer of coal, a major producer of gas, and at the moment the federal government is doing nothing to limit, new gas projects, new coal projects, and so aligning with the Pacific for a fossil fuel-free Pacific is a challenge for Australia. And I just want to see if you want to ask me a question, but
I have one on the just.
Well, in the context that Australia has its hand up to host the United Nations climate
That was
talks.
my question.
Yeah, with Pacific Island countries in 2 years' time, in 2026. And the Pacific has this history of global leadership, of really helping the whole world to think about climate change and develop a coordinated response to climate change. And Australia dragged its feet the whole time. In Paris, our foreign minister at the time, Julie Bishop, she was not aware of this high ambition coalition, until more than 100 countries had joined. And she suddenly realized, she went and immediately tried to befriend Tony de Bruyn, and oh, hang on, where? So, there's this tendency in Australia to think of Pacific Island countries as small and vulnerable in Australia's backyard. But in that moment, the shoe was on the other foot. The Pacific were the powerful ones shaping the global discussion, and Australia was the one that was behind. So hosting the UN climate talks, Australia needs to learn from the Pacific. And this is a difficult circle to square. Australia as a major fossil fuel exporter, and Australia wants to be a partner to the Pacific. But the thing is, Australia's interests are changing. So all of Australia's destination markets for coal and for gas, they have signed on to the Paris Agreement. They're setting 2030 targets. They're setting 2035 targets. The direction, in 2018, global investment in clean energy overtook global investment in fossil fuels. This year, it's going to be nearly double. So there is a global energy transition that's underway, and parts of the Australian government, parts of the Australian industry realise that, our big exports are coal, gas, iron ore. This global energy transition is going to be a big issue for Australia. And so Australia needs to, this is what the future made in Australia is about. The federal government has these ambitions for Australia to be a renewable energy powerhouse. And hosting COP31 if Australia is to square the circle and be a genuine ally for Pacific countries, it has to be the moment that Australia tells the rest of the world that we are transitioning away from our past as a fossil fuel heavyweight to our future as a clean energy power. And, you know,
That's your hope anyway.
like you, Corinne, I worry that I'll have my heart broken when we host the COP, and we could use it to greenwash. And
It'll be very interesting to see how the Pacific uses the COP
absolutely. Well,
as an opportunity.
but
right?
but that's where my sense of hope comes, because in doing this research with George, with Filori, having learned from so many of the people that I was able to talk to who've been involved in Pacific climate negotiations for 30 years, the Pacific won't let Australia get away with a greenwash COP. So I think let's do it and let's learn from each other. You know, like, I think that's what we're doing here in this room, right? But I also think that it would be very exciting. You know, that it's not without risk, but I think the Pacific will continue to press for action on fossil fuels. And Australia, you know, we're making some good strides, actually. You know, the federal government, you know, we are a world leader in solar on rooftops. Australians love solar on their rooftops. 1 in 3 Australian households have solar on their rooftops. 40% of our main national grid is renewables now. We're headed towards more than 80% this decade. We're closing our coal-fired power plants. When they get old, they're being replaced by wind, solar, storage. So Australia has a good story to tell, but we need to bite off what we're doing about our coal and gas exports. So we have 2 years to develop a real reform agenda for coal and gas, that we are able to tell the world that we have a plan for phasing out coal and gas production and developing new clean energy industries.
I want to finish with a question, Wes, about the key characteristics that you think have defined Pacific climate advocacy and you know, help them to reach you know, outcomes, real outcomes in terms of climate action and climate justice.
Well, I think Pacific Island countries have real moral authority when it comes to talking about climate change. You know, if climate change is a threat to your existence as a nation, their existence as people, and the Pacific has stuck to the science in all of the discussions. The Pacific fought for 1.5 degrees. You know, the Pacific is only asking what the science tells us needs to be done and has been resolute. And also that unique form of collective diplomacy. So working together as a block of countries, the Pacific has a long history of working together as a block of countries in the post-independence era, the Blue Pacific, and it's really those things that moral authority, sticking to the science and working together as a block of countries, that's how Pacific Island countries have shaped the global climate discussion.
Thank you very much for that discussion. That was very, very interesting. And I certainly learned through it. We'll now open it to questions from the audience. Robert.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. It was great to hear, and the book that you came up with your partners. I've met George Carter. I keep calling him Daniel Carter, but because it's rugby. But Dr. George Carter plays an instrumental role in the Pacific in terms of negotiation, and I met him in so many COPs as well, and how we negotiated. And just you mentioned something important, and that was trade. You said it was boring. It was getting boring. And I just want to get your perspective on, because we know from where we come from, the Pacific depends too much on aid. That's one thing. But an important component for development in the Pacific is trade. And its largest trading partner is Australia. So if we are to depend on aid all the time, but financial instruments that are there are not favorable to our condition, to us. Trade is another way that we can do this. But then we're constrained with trade because the prices that are coming from Australia are right up there, and it's cheaper for us to import from China, Asia, than to our brothers and sisters in Australia. So what would I would say, what's your way forward? Because if we want to buy solar panels, then do the transition, but I'm sorry, we can't afford it from Australia. We're going to Asia. And an example I would give is a hydroponic system I'm trying to set up in schools that I'm trying to get to Kiribati. We couldn't afford it from Australia. We are waiting for the shipment to come from China. So in terms of climate diplomacy and the politics and the geopolitics, what's your take on that?
Well, one thing that's really interesting is that, when I was doing my doctorate on trade and the Pacific was arguing, quite rightly, that factors of economic geography make it very hard for Pacific Island countries to participate in international trade in the same way that other countries do. Costs of transport, things like that. Like Tuvalu and Kiribati, very spread out, right? Islands that are a long way from each other, and it costs a lot to transport things around. But one thing that they arrived at was, well, actually, there's opportunities for, movement of people. So it's not a simple story. There's parts of the story that are crunchy, but this is, during that discussion about trade, Australia actually learned that, for countries like Kiribati, for countries like Tuvalu, we could and should be helping people to have opportunities to live, work and study in Australia, and, mobility. So people, if capital is not going to these countries, then perhaps these countries can come to capital. And it's not a simple story, but tens of thousands of Pacific Islanders come to Australia each year to earn money working in Australian agriculture, and they take that money home and they use it to buy solar panels in villages. And so for countries like Tuvalu, trade is actually partly a story about migration and mobility. And that's linked with climate, obviously, with the security deal that Australia signed with Tuvalu that incorporates migration.
I want to ask you a question about China. We didn't mention China yet. How does that play into the whole, diplomacy scene and climate diplomacy? In Australia, we get a very particular angle told in the media that we should be scared of China, but that's not, that China is not viewed in that light necessarily in the rest of the Pacific region. How does China play into the Pacific's international climate diplomacy efforts?
So Australia, to paraphrase, is a bit freaked out about China in the Pacific. So Australia has had a strategic interest in Pacific Island countries that's been pretty steady for the last 150 years. In the late 19th century, the Australian colonies, the settler colonies in New South Wales and Queensland, worried that other major powers would develop a presence in the islands near Australia, and they lobbied London to annex these islands, not, so that the French or the Germans wouldn't be too close to Australia. And in the end, the British kind of listened to that, and they came to arrangements with Germany. But the point of the story is that it's that same strategic instinct that drives Australia's engagement with Pacific Island countries now, but the major powers with the big navy that they're worried about has changed. So it's not necessarily France or Germany, it's China now. And the United States is very interested in the Pacific now as well. So at the end of the Cold War, the United States withdrew. So they closed down embassies, Peace Corps volunteers stopped coming, a lot of them. And then the last couple of years, so Kamala Harris met with Pacific Island leaders in 2022. Pacific Island leaders have been to the White House as a group to meet with Biden. This is unheard of before. So the US is really interested, and China's really interested. And Australia's really interested, and it's China that's driving the interest.
Yeah.
So, sorry, to answer the question, is that the Pacific's kind of back on the map for major power geostrategic competition. And that's a challenge and an opportunity. You know, looking at the history, the Pacific was able to leverage major power competition and interest during the Cold War in ways that served the Pacific's own interests. So I probably don't have time to tell the story, but you know, when the Soviet Union wanted a fishing base in Kiribati, the Pacific negotiated a tuna boat, a treaty with the United States for access to tuna in the Pacific. And so again, a relatively small country, a small island state, but actually a large ocean state, was able to take on major powers and achieve their interests. So, you know, China's a challenge and an opportunity when it comes to climate.
Thanks, Wes. Hello, Pete, got a question?
Now we have actually a couple of questions. One's just come in. One question is from Jenny Goldie, and she just asked what happened to Dr. Ian Fry, who was so active in the COP meetings from Copenhagen to Paris. I think Ian's gone on to another role, hasn't he?
He's a United
The UN.
Nations Commissioner for Climate and Human Rights.
Yeah, advocate.
He is the UN Special Rapporteur.
Special Rapporteur.
Yeah, Special Rapporteur, that's right.
So the second question is from Catherine McCullum. If there is an Australia Pacific hosted COP31, what specific demands could we make of the Australian government to ensure it is really a partnership? And a third question, sorry. The surge of battery technology in electric cars, solar panels and wind turbines resulting from a push to meet Paris climate agreements will see global mineral demand increase, especially on seabed mining. For example, Nauru's controversy. How do you see the commercial race to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean?
The seabed mining issue is huge and hugely contentious in the Pacific. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, Wes?
Yes. So one thing to say, so there's a Tongan philosopher, Apeli Hauofa, who wrote a piece called Our Sea of Islands, which is a sort of a seminal piece for understanding contemporary regionalism in the Pacific. And what he says is that when Europeans arrived in the Pacific, they saw small islands in a far sea, but we are actually an interconnected sea of islands. And there's this, you know, in the post-independence era, Pacific Island countries have developed regional connections based on their connection to each other and to the ocean. And so the issue of seabed mining is contentious because, you know, there is a sense that the region's connection to the ocean is kind of a sacred connection. And so you know, at the moment, it's illegal to mine in the world's high seas, which is the majority of the world's ocean. And so a large part of the surface of the earth, you're not allowed to mine there. Sorry, can't open this up too much, but it's a big debate. And there's a longer version I'll tell another time, which involves some very unscrupulous interests that formed partnerships with some individuals in some countries who want to see seabed mining, but there's also a lot of resistance to the idea, including a number of Pacific countries who want to have a ban on seabed mining and a moratorium on seabed mining in the high seas as well.
Yeah, and others who are open to it because they believe that it might be financially
Yeah, so there's a debate,
beneficial.
particularly the Cook Islands and, you know, and also, yes, Nauru. Well,
Yeah.
yes, Kiribati has, so there's one particular group of companies that have developed relationships with Tonga, Kiribati, Nauru, and it's the same, and they had previously in Papua New Guinea. So previously with Nautilus in Papua New Guinea, and so yeah, but that might be a story for another day.
Yeah.
Let me come back to the question on what would be the ask of the Australian government to ensure it is really a partnership.
So I think that'll be one for, you know, I don't want to sound glib, but the Australian government and Pacific governments will need to answer that question. So, you know, I've already said what I think. You know, the Pacific wants a fossil fuel free Pacific. 11 of the 14 independent Pacific Island countries are already calling for a global treaty to manage the phase out of fossil fuels. So, you know, there are a range of things though. Australia should be working with the Pacific to promote an agenda around oceans. Australia should be working with the Pacific to promote action, you know, a global commitment to providing funds for loss and damage. You know, this is a fight the Pacific's been leading for 30 years. So there won't be one thing. There'll be a number of things that need to form part of a COP31 partnership. And, you know, it has to be action on adaptation. You know, the Pacific has established a Pacific Resilience Fund, a regional fund that's intended to be uniquely suited to the scale of adaptation that you need for Pacific communities, you know, for the sorts of things that help communities to adapt to climate change. So Australia will need to address all of those, as well as our fossil fuel exports.
I think there's two aspects for me to the notion of a partnership around COP31. One is in the process of COP31, what it looks like, what the agenda is, etc. And the other is actually on the outcomes of that partnership. So you're talking about the outcomes, but there's also a lot of discussion around, you know, how Australia is going to co-host
Yes.
this COP31
Yes.
in a way that really puts Pacific governments at the decision-making table as well.
So I think they're in discussions about the formal governance arrangements for a COP31 presidency at the moment, and I don't know exactly how it will look. George Carter will have a better idea than I would, but you know, as I understand it, it will be an Australian presidency in partnership with the Pacific. So interesting language. It's kind of not both the president, an Australian presidency in partnership with the Pacific. But there will be Pacific involvement in the setting of the agenda for the presidency and in discussions throughout. And I think, you know, Australia needs to meet the test, you know.
And may I also add that, you know, partnership at government level is, of course, very, very important, but partnership at civil society level needs to actually occur as well. And part of having the fellows here is to, you know, develop their networks with the Australian climate movement so that we can really maximize collaboration and maximize impact ahead of COP31 as well. Now there was a question from Reverend Wang.
Wes, thank you for sharing your story. Now, there's a saying that knowledge is power, but in the Pacific, it is relationship that is power. So my question is, in your finding with Pacific academics on this area, how would you encourage those of us in the room, diaspora leaders and community advocates, to share our relationship one with another? Because we are here because of our groups from the islands. We need to hear their stories. And what I've heard tonight, it is the cry from the Pacific. It is the relationship of each of those islands in people. So how would you encourage those of us, in the diaspora in Australia, to join, together, to bring that story into the front.
I think the work that you're doing here tonight is really important. I think that the fellowship program is that you guys have revived and is crucially important. At the moment, I think there's a lot of power in this room already, but this discussion could become the center of the national discussion over the next 2 years. So continuing to build these connections, you might feel like at times you're sort of to the side of the national conversation. But if we host the COP, it will be the biggest diplomatic event Australia's ever hosted. It'll be at least 30,000 people will come. It'll be in the global spotlight, and these relationships will move to the center stage. But they need to be real relationships. You can't just pull them out of a hat. You have to build on actual connections that people have to each other and learn from each other. And so, this is really important work, what's happening tonight in terms of the fellowship program that the Edmund Rice Centre has.
Absolutely. And thank you for, I'll remember your quote that, in the Pacific, relationships are power. It is so true. And it's something that I had to learn when I started, 6 years ago working in this space. And I remember my director saying, you build the relationships, and from the relationships, the work will come. And it's exactly what happened. And I think part of, having these beautiful young people here is to try and build relationships with us, of course, between us, but with other organizations in Australia. And they have a whole lot of events planned, with different community groups, including Uniting and others, many others, to really try and connect and build a network. So they're here to actually meet people, to build those relationships so that, there is greater collaboration ahead of the COP. And hopefully, we'll have another intake, next year. And we'd like to do more, but we just don't have the funding to do more. But and also, Robert, did you want to talk about what you were talking about today about the importance of Australians going over as well?
Yes, I briefly mentioned this is what I took to DFAT when I went to Canberra yesterday. That, like you said, the story is the cry, but we're tired of crying. We're tired of telling our stories throughout the world, different platforms. And it's sort of going nowhere because, one, we need to change the mentality. That's why I tried to push that the exchange program, to increase it to potential leaders, the youth that are coming up, so that when they are at that stage, when they become leaders of our countries, you may not be here, but then that you set the platform, that we've trusted that there. So it's not just us coming all the time. We need youths from here as well to live our reality. Because from my own experience, I was brought up and raised in Fiji for my life, 30 years. And then I decided to move to Kiribati. When everyone is moving away from Kiribati, I moved to Kiribati to try and make a change and go back to my ancestral land. And that's why I want this experience for everyone, because it humbled me. Things I take for granted back in Fiji, it's not that much. It's not as much as what we have here in Australia. From water, from vegetables, simple things that we take for granted. You are humbled there because it's not enough. And that's when you realize that you do not need all these things to be happy in life. I have to readjust my lifestyle, the food I eat, the transportation. You don't have taxis there. You don't have Uber where it's just a fingertip away. So that's why this sort of fellowship is one of the way forward to bring that mentality to the future leaders. that are coming up. And these are my brothers and sisters from Tuvalu and Kiribati and the rest of the Pacific. And I only wish that we have the discussion as well with youths from Australia, Indigenous people. I was here last year when the disappointing referendum went on. It was disappointing because we came to meet the Indigenous people in Cairns at LSIP. So I'm hoping for COP, I'll try to put this one thing straight forward. Maybe to really see Australia's commitment to the Pacific, bring it back again. Bring it back again. And the Pacific is watching. And if they're able to make a change, that yes, we're taking these issues seriously, protecting Indigenous lands and stop the minings, then we can say, okay, yes, Australia is getting somewhere, is now following us in what we're doing, what we've been fighting for. Like you mentioned, the Pacific has been leading the fight globally, but Australia has been lacking down. Maybe before we have 2 years. Make that change and we'll see. That's the way I want to see it. And that's when there's assurance to the future generation that Australia is stepping up.
Yeah.
That's it. Thank you.
That's a good note to. Thanks, Wes, again for joining us tonight and giving us that really important perspective on history that will serve us well, hopefully, over the next 2 years. Alofi, do you want to close?
Yes, thank you. But Wes, can I also thank you for bringing this story of the Pacific leadership today. And sorry, I'll come on screen so people can see me. And apologies, everyone online. We saw a myriad of questions. What I might do is get Wes to look at them, and if he can get the chance, maybe give us some answers, and we can distribute to it. But we just ran out of time tonight. I mean, it's been a wonderful discussion. And with what you pointed to was the way in which Pacific leadership has manifested on climate. But can I say it's been a much longer journey than climate. It started, well, the Pacific never stopped being an area of leadership, whether it was through the decolonization period, whether it was through the nuclear-free Pacific that you mentioned, whether it was through other areas of international diplomacy, and where that voice of the Pacific as a group has been so significant in so many different areas. And they are bringing that group to bear through, as you say, the International Court of Justice, through a range of other mechanisms besides just the UN FCC process to try and address this issue. But it is also an area where that voice should be taken seriously and should be given the opportunity to be heard. So thank you. And if you don't mind, fellows, we've had a lot of requests on our task for them to see you and to hear just briefly from you, if that's okay. So if you don't mind just quickly saying hello to our audience online, because they were so keen to see you. And Aselu, if you wouldn't mind coming up front and just quickly introducing yourself again, as well as Giti, Giti and they can be seen here. So if you just speak to the camera there and
hello everyone. My name is Selu. I'm from Tuvalu. I work as the land surveyor under the Ministry of Natural Resources. Also for the Land and Surveying Department. It's good to be here in Australia. Getting a bit of a cold, eh? Coming from 31 degrees to 12 degrees is quite nice something. But yeah, I'm just blessed to be here, be part of this fellowship, and to learn and exchange knowledge with the guys over here. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone. Hi everyone, and those of you who have just joined us tonight. My name is Rapena, and I'm from Christmas Island. It's one of the islands in Kiribati, and I'm thankful that we get the opportunity to come here and learn more about climate change and engage in the schedules and program that we are here for. We are so thankful for the Edmund Rice Center and organization for getting us the opportunity to come here, because this is the opportunity that we really needed right now. Our country is at the forefront of climate change, and we are experiencing the devastating impact of climate change. So to be here and learn more about climate change is a profound thing for us, because we really need this knowledge, and having the knowledge is very important for us, and it's very crucial in these times of climate change, so that everyone knows about climate change and they can involve in the battle against climate change. And I believe that having the knowledge alone is not enough to combat climate change, because that is only enough to control our emissions as a nation. And we are not even the top contributors to the global carbon footprint or emission. So I really hope that we'll make use of the opportunities here and learn as much as we can, so that we'll bring those knowledge back and we'll maybe teach people back home whenever we get the opportunity to do so that everyone know about climate change, and they know what to do when the consequences kept on going. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Miriam Morias, and I'm currently the president of the Rotaract Youth Club of Kiribati under the Rotary International. Climate change for me is specifically talking. Climate change to me is not a topic that can be like talked about. For me, it's like an emotional topic, because in Kiribati, we live every day with climate change, and it's my first time in Australia. So when I came to Australia, I noticed that we are living in a very, very sad environment in Kiribati. In Kiribati, I thought that using brackish water for showering and salty water for drinking, I thought it was normal. I thought everything was normal, but attending these types of workshops and seeing Australia and the outside of Australia is a really beautiful place, and it makes me feel really, really sad that I just had to notice that we are living in a really, really sad environment. And I thank DFAT for the opportunity to learn more. And I give great thanks to Edmund Rice for taking us in, carrying us over their shoulders, and providing us with the best service. And I thank everyone present here today, and you guys for watching. Thank you. Come down.
Hello everyone. My name is Marion. I represent from the Organization for Persons with Disability in Tuvalu. That is Fusialofa Association. And being here in Australia and learn to network with and engage with other NGOs in different sort of levels, internationally and nationally. It will bring more insights so that I can get back home and implement whatever we are going through for the next few weeks here in Australia. And we're learning a lot of sort of new things, and hopefully what we learn will in a couple of weeks here will really bring for persons with disability, they are the most vulnerable people facing climate change, the impacts of climate change back into value. Imagining, obviously, I'm not a person with disabilities, but what if we put our shoes, walking the shoes of a person with disability facing impacts of climate change? How would they feel when it comes to natural disasters? And coming here will, it is the first time here for me to be here in Australia, and it's emotional too with me, trying to get to know how the different lifestyles that Australia is facing, experiencing here, and comparing it back home. So thank you, Edmund Rice community, for having us here. And I would like to learn a lot more to be here in a few weeks' time. And thank you for Thailand.
Talofa everyone, Talofa again. My name is Kitty and I'm a fellow from Tuvalu. I'm currently the communications officer for Tukan, which is a NGO in Tuvalu. Our organization aims to be the leading NGO in fighting climate change in Tuvalu. And it's an honor to be here, to see and meet new people, and especially it's an honor to be a part of this fellowship program, as it will help build my capacity in a lot of things, because this is also an opportunity for us youths, for us to voice out our concerns, not only to voice out, and we actually hope as a youth, we can be a part of that community. We could be talking, but sometimes we are not heard. So this is a really big opportunity for us, and I am so honored. I'm so sorry, I had so much to say, but I just forgot. But yeah, it is such an honor to be here and to meet everyone. Thank you to Edmund Rice Center for this fellowship, and what an opportunity it is. And we really hope to get to know everyone and work together with everyone and learn, and so much help. Thank you.
Maori again, everyone, and those who just joined us. I think I won't talk much. I'll introduce myself. I'm Robert, a fellow from Kiribati as well, as the national coordinator for the Kiribati Climate Action Network. And I again like to acknowledge the Edmund Rice Center and its support to Kiribati and Tuvalu. All these years, they've been a partner with Kirikan for more than 10 years now. And it's a partnership that we can say it's fruiting. So I'll support this program. We wish more program like this in the coming years that continues training our future leaders. And again, thank you so much for this opportunity to be here with you all, and God bless and take care.
I'll just get on camera and wish everyone and thank everyone for participating in tonight's event. We'll finish up now, but thank you all for attending what has been a remarkable webinar. This is one of many that we've hosted in the past, but I hope we'll be hosting more in future. Can I thank Corinne? Can I thank Wes? Can I thank our fellows, all making this event an amazing event?